Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library, and I have a great story to tell you. For tonight, we will visit three ancient cities that were abandoned long ago. We will talk about them, including who built them, as far as we know, and why they were abandoned. We will first go to South America, to Peru, and explore the settlement of Machu Picchu, an Inca settlement. Then we will travel to Africa, specifically Sudan, to learn about the city of Meroë, which served as a capital for several centuries in the Kingdom of Kush in Nubia. Lastly, we will journey to Asia and discover Mohenjo-Daro, one of the oldest, if not the oldest, large cities in the world. However, very little is known about the culture that built it. Along with Mohenjo-Daro, I will tell you more about the Indus Valley Civilization. But first, as you might already know, we have a Patreon page for those who would like to support this project directly and also listen ad-free on your favorite podcast app. Our least expensive tier is $3.50 per month, but it doesn't mean you will get less. We let people contribute what they wish or can, and everyone gets everything that is on our page, because the world is a better place when the sun shines for everyone. You will gain access to 26 exclusive episodes. We add a new one every month, and you can listen and download all the episodes with and without background sounds. And as a token of gratitude, we offer advance releases to our patrons. We have added links to Patreon, as well as links to different streaming options, which may be better suited for you. You will find them in the description of the episode. But before we begin, if you wish to, you may close your eyes and allow yourself to forget about any worries. Assume a comfortable position. Maybe move a bit to settle. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath, and when you slowly exhale, feel your shoulders drop. Release the tension in your neck. Let your face soften and your jaw relax. Make sure your fingers are not clenched and that your legs are relaxed too. And allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. And now, off we go. Our first stop is one of the most famous and visually striking archaeological sites in the world, the citadel of Machu Picchu. It is a site you have probably seen in pictures, located in the mountains of southern Peru, on a high ridge amid gray rocks, green jungle, and blue sky. There are the remains of a small city, or perhaps a large estate, where emperors of the Inca Empire sometimes resided. It is about 50 miles or 80 kilometers from Cusco, the former capital of the Inca Empire, and a city that still exists today. Machu Picchu is neither the largest nor the oldest of the Inca ruins, but it is certainly the most famous because of its beauty. Its relevance as an imperial estate, and the story of its discovery. It was never completely lost. The site was abandoned, but local people knew that it existed beneath the jungle vegetation that had covered much of it. However, it did not attract widespread archaeological interest until the 20th century. But first, to understand what Machu Picchu is about, we need to talk about the rise and fall of the Incas. In pre-Columbian America, the Inca Empire was the largest state in the early 16th century. When the Spaniards started conquering and colonizing the continent. The conquest of the Incas began in 1532, after the Spaniards had well established their domination to the north in Mexico, and 40 years later, the last Inca stronghold fell. This empire extended along the Andes Mountains and the Pacific coast of South America for thousands of miles, from what is now Ecuador to the north of Chile, and its heart corresponded to modern Peru. But the Incas were only the last and probably the most successful at conquering other peoples among the many civilizations or cultures that had appeared in this part of the world, beginning several thousand years earlier. Several thousand years before our era, the Incas were a people who lived in the highlands of Peru. Sometime in the 13th century, less than 300 years before Columbus reached America, they began expanding from there. They established their capital in Cusco and conquered through war and diplomacy many other peoples to the north and south. Over several generations, they reached their peak at the beginning of the 16th century, just as the Spanish conquest began. Maybe they could have expanded farther and continued progressing if this process had not been interrupted. Because they were geographically isolated from Asia, Europe, and Africa, they followed a particular path to civilization. They had discovered or inherited the basic technical knowledge that made them a rather advanced civilization. They made pottery and textiles, had a mythology, and built cities with elaborate architecture, urban planning, and administration. In fields such as agriculture and medicine, they were quite advanced for their time. On the other hand, they did not use iron. They still lived in the Bronze Age. They did not use the wheel for transportation or farming. They did not have a writing system, and there are no Inca texts from before the Spanish conquest, unlike the documents produced by some pre-Columbian cultures in Central America and Mexico. The Incas did, however, keep records and communicate across distances using quipus, which were knotted strings. But they were still very skilled builders. They built or expanded a vast road network that reached all corners of their empire. They produced very refined crafts and managed to occupy many different regions, not only the mountains and highlands of the Andes, but also deserts, coastlines, and jungles. Because they annexed regions that were quite far apart, many languages were spoken throughout the empire. What unified these territories was their administration, which was highly centralized. It seems that the Incas did not hesitate to move entire groups of people from one corner of the empire to another, so that they would populate regions the state wanted settled. And so these people would lose their cultural identity and become simply subjects of the emperor. There was also a large army, and the figure of the Sapa Inca, the emperor, who was considered a divine being and was not only the head of state but also the head of state religion. This figure was another element that unified the vast state. The Sapa Inca claimed descent from Inti, the sun god and patron of the Inca state. The common belief was that Inti had been created by the creator god Viracocha, and as descendants of Inti, the Inca emperor was directly connected to the creation of the world. So nothing was too good for the Sapa Inca. This is how the construction of Machu Picchu should be understood. This is how the construction of Machu Picchu should be understood. Most archaeologists believe that it was an imperial estate, a residence built for the emperor during the reign of Pachacuti. Pachacuti was an important figure in the Inca dynasty because he greatly expanded the empire and transformed the kingdom of Cusco, which he ruled at the beginning of his reign, into the Inca Empire. At the time, just a few decades before the Spaniards arrived, the Incas were expanding rapidly, and the population within their borders was growing. Devotion to the emperor was probably extraordinary, and although Cusco remained the capital, the emperor had this residence or retreat built for him about 50 miles away. There is no indication that the site had been permanently inhabited before, which also makes it very interesting because it was constructed over only a few decades in a distinctly Inca style. It included monumental architecture and agricultural terraces that displayed the knowledge and skill of the Incas in mountain agriculture, as well as their typical polished dry stone walls, that is, walls made from cut stones of different sizes, fitted together with remarkable precision. Machu Picchu was used for approximately 80 years before it had to be abandoned amid the Spanish conquest and the civil war that was causing the Inca Empire to crumble. It is not known exactly what happened to its residents. They may have fled or died from diseases such as smallpox, which the invaders had introduced to the Americas. Conquistadors and later other Europeans reached many Inca settlements, which were mapped and sometimes transformed. But this does not seem to have happened at Machu Picchu, probably because it was remote and had been abandoned without resistance. There is no clear trace that Europeans had even visited the site before the 19th century, several centuries later. This is why the site is sometimes called the Lost City. It was largely forgotten, including by most descendants of the Incas. However, it was not entirely lost, because people living in nearby villages, only a few miles from the site, knew that it existed. But to most of the outside world, Machu Picchu remained completely unknown. So what was life like at Machu Picchu during its period of splendor? It seems that it was occupied by the emperor seasonally, like a kind of summer palace. When the emperor was present, there may have been about 750 people living there, probably including his family, guards, hundreds of support staff, and likely a few priests as well. Because Machu Picchu was rather remote, many things were produced directly there. For example, there were terraces for agriculture and animals, such as llamas and alpacas, which provided wool and meat, as well as a few dogs. The terraces were quite elaborate. In a mountainous environment, it is difficult to grow crops because the ground is not flat, So the Incas mastered the construction of terraces where they would grow food and properly manage water. At Machu Picchu, rainfall was abundant, so the main problem was not bringing water to the terraces, but draining it correctly. For this reason, the terraces were built in several layers. Large stones were placed at the bottom, followed by gravel, sand, and on top rich soil brought from the valley below. In this way, excess water drained gradually because it could trickle slowly through the different layers instead of stagnating or running down the mountain all at once. Studies of the site suggest that there was not enough space under cultivation to feed its hundreds of residents, so some of the food was probably brought in from the nearby valleys. However, potatoes and corn were grown on the terraces surrounding the most spectacular part of the site, its buildings. There are approximately 200 buildings spread across the uneven terrain and arranged on many different levels. Numerous stairways provided access from one level to another throughout the site. One section is known as the popular district or residential district, where people of lower social status lived. Their houses were simple, and this section also contained storage buildings. There was also a separate area containing the houses of the nobility and a royal palace. Several temples and other religious structures were also built at Machu Picchu, including a temple to the sun. It has been identified as such because similar structures known to have been temples to the sun have been found in other Inca cities, including Cusco. The temple has a semicircular tower-like enclosure that is open on one side and is characteristic of Inca architecture. Its windows were apparently not positioned at random. One of them, known as the solstice window, was aligned with the rising sun on the solstice, not with its exact position today, but with where it rose in the 15th century. This kind of alignment, which demonstrates knowledge of astronomy and the seasonal positions of celestial bodies, can be found in several other parts of Machu Picchu. Another example is the Intihuatana stone, which may have functioned as an astronomical clock or calendar. Many other similar stones have been found throughout the Inca Empire. They were arranged to point directly at the sun during the summer solstice, and it is believed that rituals took place near them. One hypothesis is that the Incas believed that these stones were necessary to hold the sun in its place along its annual path in the sky. They would not have just been instruments to measure its position, but also like anchors that kept the world in order. Another important place at Machu Picchu is a cave called Inti. The name comes from Quechua, Inti meaning sun, and Machai meaning cave or cavern. So it means sun cave or cave of the sun. The cave was used to observe the sun during the December solstice, the winter solstice. Every year, the Incas celebrated a festival in December called the Ritual Feast of the Sun. The celebration began early in the month and ended on the day of the solstice. On that day, boys were initiated into manhood, and it is believed that the initiation ceremony for noble boys may have taken place at Inti. They stood inside the cave and watched the sunrise through a kind of tunnel-like window. It had been aligned so that the sunlight could pass through it and illuminate the cave for only a few days each year, around the December solstice. Precisely how Machu Picchu was built is also unknown. Its construction required thousands upon thousands of cut stones, many of which were fitted together with great precision to form the walls. The Incas used a variety of building techniques. They knew how to build with adobe and had access to many different construction materials. So why did they not use mortar in their finest stonework, as many other civilizations did? Stone was more prestigious and was probably considered more aesthetically pleasing. It was also more durable. Many Inca monuments have survived for centuries almost unchanged, at least in their stone sections. Another advantage of dry stone construction and the tight fit between the blocks was their resistance to earthquakes. The entire empire was located in a seismically active region, and this is reflected in its architecture. Tightly fitted stones without mortar helped stabilize buildings when the ground moved. Doors and windows were also often trapezoidal, narrowing from bottom to top, which gave them greater stability. The walls had various stabilizing features as well. On the exterior corners were often joined using L-shaped blocks. Thanks to all these features, many Inca buildings have survived for centuries in remarkably good condition. In any case, transporting and cutting stone blocks was an enormous task. The blocks probably did not come from very far away, but they still had to be moved along the trails and up to Machu Picchu. I mentioned earlier that the Incas did not use the wheel for transportation. This does not necessarily mean that they were unfamiliar with the concept of the wheel, but they apparently never built chariots or wagons. This has often been attributed to their lack of suitable draft animals. They had no horses, cattle, or comparable animals capable of pulling heavy loads. The mountainous terrain may also have been a factor. Although their empire eventually expanded beyond the mountains, their culture originated in the highlands, where wheeled transportation would have been less practical than on open plains. The stones were therefore probably moved into place by large groups of men over a period of several years. For several years, the region around Cusco was contested between the Spaniards and what remained of the Inca state. The Spaniards were few in number, and they had difficulty controlling the entire region. Once their invasion began, the empire collapsed very quickly. It was dismantled in only a few years, but an independent Inca state survived at Vilcabamba until 1572. One of the sons of Huayna Capac, the emperor who had ruled shortly before the arrival of the invaders, was Manco Inca Yupanqui. In December 1533, the Spaniards placed Manco Inca on the throne as a puppet emperor because they needed the Inca administration to help them control these vast territories. However, he later rebelled against them and established a small independent state in the remote region of Vilcabamba, known as the Neo-Inca state. His dynasty managed to survive there from 1537 until 1572. Meanwhile, the Spaniards strengthened their control over what are now Peru and Ecuador. Finally, the last ruler of the Neo-Inca state, Tupac Amaru, was captured and executed in 1572, bringing the independent Inca state to an end. Machu Picchu had already been abandoned by this time because it was remote and located in a sparsely populated area. It was largely forgotten and soon became covered by vegetation. More than 3 centuries later, Hiram Bingham brought the site to international and archaeological attention. Its architecture and mountain setting also attracted great interest, and during the 20th century, Machu Picchu became an icon of the Inca civilization. For our second visit tonight, let's head to Africa, more precisely to the region of Nubia in what is now Sudan, and to the ruins of Meroë, the capital of the Kingdom of Kush. For several centuries, the Kingdom of Kush was a powerful state that developed an advanced civilization. It traded with other parts of the ancient world and became powerful enough to invade Egypt during the first millennium BC. Egypt was ruled by Nubian pharaohs for several generations. Meroë became the capital of Kush in the 6th century BC, and its ruins give us an idea of the wealth and influence of its kings. The site contains more than 200 pyramids. They look familiar because they recall Egyptian architecture, while also displaying distinct Nubian characteristics. There is much more to say about them, so let's explore this history. First, we need to talk about the historical region of Nubia. As you know, ancient Egypt was historically divided into 2 main regions: Lower Egypt in the north, which included the Nile Delta, and Upper Egypt, farther south, where Egyptian civilizations flourished along the Nile River. Beyond Upper Egypt, the Nile continued southward through the desert. South of Upper Egypt lay Nubia, beginning at the first cataract of the Nile. Along this stretch of the river were several cataracts, shallow rocky passages where stones and boulders broke the surface of the water, making navigation difficult and sometimes impossible. Nubia extended southward toward the point where the Blue Nile and the White Nile meet. These 2 rivers are the main tributaries of the Nile, and their confluence is near Khartoum, the capital of modern Sudan. Egyptian civilizations developed in Upper and Lower Egypt, in no small part because of the geography and climate. The Nile Valley was fertile, while the deserts on both sides offered protection. But conditions south of Upper Egypt were not entirely different. South of the first cataract, other cultures emerged, and they too formed states, founded cities. One of the earliest known civilizations in Nubia is known as the Kerma culture, or the Kingdom of Kerma. It emerged around 2500 BC and flourished until about 1500 BC, a period of approximately 1,000 years. Its center was in Upper Nubia, in what is now northern Sudan. Over time, Kerma expanded northward as far as the first cataract, where its frontier met Upper Egypt. By then, Egypt had developed into a powerful state, and during the Middle Kingdom, that is to say, from about 2000 to 1700 BC, there appears to have been extensive trade, as well as periods of warfare between Egypt and Nubia. The Egyptians obtained various valuable resources from Nubia, including incense, ivory, and especially gold, since the region had rich gold mines. They therefore established trade relations and frequently sent military expeditions when circumstances allowed. During the Egyptian New Kingdom, around 1500 BC, Egypt conquered a large part of Nubia and began ruling it directly. This brought an end to the Kingdom of Kerma, but the Egyptians always had difficulty controlling Nubia. It was a vast region, and although they built forts along the Nile, they were never able to suppress resistance completely. When the New Kingdom declined, Nubia regained its independence. Over time, a new Nubian kingdom emerged, centered farther south around Napata. This kingdom was called Kush. The Egyptians had long used the name Kush for a region of Nubia, and this new state began to take shape after Egyptian control ended in the 11th century BC. Because it had formed in a region that had been occupied by Egypt, Kush had many cultural affinities with Egyptian civilization. We will see this in its architecture, but its religion was also strongly influenced by Egypt. The Kushites adopted the worship of Amun, the god who had become particularly important in Egypt, especially in Upper Egypt, during the New Kingdom. Apart from these influences, however, their customs, language, and appearance was different. The Nubians were black Africans, and Egyptian art typically distinguished them through their skin color, clothing, hairstyles, and other visual characteristics. Their way of life was also different. Like the Egyptians, the Kushites depended on the Nile for agriculture, but they relied much more heavily on herding. They made greater use of wool than of flax or cotton. Their art and artifacts were easy to distinguish from those of Egypt, even though the two civilizations maintained close ties. The Kingdom of Kush had particularly close ties with Upper Egypt, so close that Egypt became increasingly divided. Kush eventually came to dominate it. Egypt was no longer unified at the beginning of the first millennium BC, and in the 8th century BC, Kushite king named Kashta also became king of Upper Egypt, apparently peacefully. His influence extended as far as Thebes, the former capital of the Egyptian New Kingdom. His successor, Pi, also known as Pianki, invaded the north, or Lower Egypt, and the Kushites eventually came to rule all over Egypt. Pi followed a pattern seen many times throughout Egyptian history. He proclaimed himself pharaoh and established a new dynasty. This dynasty, the 25th, is also known as the Nubian dynasty or the Kushite dynasty, and its rulers are sometimes called the Black Pharaohs. It lasted for about a century until Egypt was invaded again, this time from the east, when the Assyrians arrived and conquered Lower Egypt and much of Upper Egypt. Assyrian control did not last long. After the Assyrians withdrew, Psamtik I, a ruler from the city of Sais, gradually reunited Egypt during the 7th century BC and established the 26th dynasty. After the Kushites were expelled from Egypt, their kingdom was once again confined to Nubia. In 1592 BC, an Egyptian army sent by Pharaoh Psamtik II invaded Nubia and reached Napata, the Kushite capital in the north. The Egyptians eventually withdrew, but the campaign demonstrated how vulnerable Napata was because of its proximity to Egypt. The Kushite kings gradually shifted their political and economic center much farther to Meroë. Meroë was not an entirely new settlement, but it became increasingly important and eventually replaced Napata as the main center of the kingdom. It was located in southern Nubia, between the 5th and the 6th cataracts of the Nile. The site may have been attractive not only because it was farther from the Egyptian frontier, but also because it lay on the edge of the summer rainfall zone and was therefore not as dry as Upper Egypt and northern Nubia. There were forests nearby, as well as iron ore, both of which were useful for ironworking. It was also well positioned for trade routes, leading east toward the Red Sea and west toward other regions of Africa. This location was probably a good choice because, despite the loss of Egypt, the Kingdom of Kush continued to prosper for several more centuries, and Meroë developed into an impressive city. It remained an important center from the early 1st millennium BC until the 4th century AD, almost 1,000 years. For several centuries, there was a balance between Napata, the older northern center, and Meroë in the south. Increasingly, however, kings and nobles were buried near Meroë, and the political and economic center of the kingdom shifted southward. Napata retained primarily a religious importance because the principal Kushite sanctuary of Amun was located near Jebel Barkal. The inhabitants of Kush worshipped a pantheon that combined Nubian and Egyptian gods, reflecting centuries of contact and the period when the Kushites had ruled Egypt. They retained a strong Egyptian influence, which is partly visible in their construction of pyramids. But the Nubians began building pyramids long after Egyptian pharaohs had stopped using large pyramids as royal tombs, and their pyramids were different. The most impressive royal pyramids in Egypt were built during the Old Kingdom in the 3rd millennium BC. Later, this practice came to an end, and the pharaohs of the New Kingdom, for example, were generally buried in underground rock-cut tombs. The use of small pyramids continued during the New Kingdom among the elite families, often marking the locations of their tombs. The Nubians adopted and adapted this tradition. They were also familiar with the much larger pyramids of northern Egypt, and they began building their own in Nubia in the 8th century BC. Nubian pyramids had a different shape from the Egyptian counterparts. Their foundations were relatively small, but they rose to heights ranging from approximately 6 to 30 meters, or 20 to 100 feet. As a result, their sides were much steeper than those of Egyptian pyramids. Of all the regions where pyramids were built, Nubia has the largest number, with more than 200. In fact, the Nubians built more pyramids over several centuries than the Egyptians ever did, although their pyramids tended to be smaller. There were no giant pyramids in Nubia, but dozens were built for kings, queens, and nobles. Over the centuries, Egypt faced invasions and foreign rule by the Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans. Relations between Kush and its northern neighbor were sometimes marked by conflict, particularly after Egypt became part of the Roman Empire in the 1st century BC. Both sides raided each other's territories until a peace treaty was signed. Apart from these periods of war, Kush and Meroë flourished in part because of iron production and long-distance trade. Iron goods were exported, along with textiles and traditional Nubian products such as ivory and gold. There is evidence that luxury goods from India, and perhaps even China, reached Nubia, most likely through trade across the Red Sea or through Egypt and other long-distance networks. Although the pyramids are the best-known remains of Meroë, partly because their stone construction allowed many of them to survive, the city also contained large temples inspired by Egyptian architecture and religion, as well as palaces and hundreds of houses. In late antiquity, the Kingdom of Kush declined and disappeared toward the end of the 4th century AD. The reason, or perhaps combination of reasons, for its decline is not well understood. Economic changes caused by increasing aridity, political infighting, and warfare may all have contributed. During the 4th century, Kush may have been attacked by the Kingdom of Aksum, a powerful state centered in what we know as Ethiopia and Eritrea. It is unclear whether Aksum actually conquered Meroë or simply contributed to its decline. At an unknown date, probably during the 4th century, the city was abandoned, and many of its pyramids were gradually buried by the sand. Christianity later spread through Nubia, and several smaller Christian kingdoms replaced Kush. In the 7th centuries, Arab armies conquered Egypt, bringing Islam with them. Islam spread into Nubia, much more gradually because the Christian Nubian kingdom survived for several centuries south of Egypt and maintained extensive trade relations with their northern neighbors. By then, however, the memory and importance of Meroë had already faded. The region was mentioned in Greek and Roman texts, whose authors often used the name Ethiopia for lands south of Egypt, including Nubia. An interesting example appears in the myth of Perseus and his adventures. Perseus traveled to Ethiopia, where he rescued Andromeda. Although the name Ethiopia was eventually given to a country southeast of Nubia, the Ethiopian known to the ancient Greeks was a much broader region south of Egypt and could include Nubia. The mythical story, therefore, was not necessarily set in modern Ethiopia, although its location cannot be identified with certainty as Nubia or the Kingdom of Kush. We still have one last stop to make tonight. For our third and final visit, we are going to travel farther east to one of the largest urban centers of early civilization, a city that in many respects remains a mystery, Mohenjo-Daro. Its name traditionally means Mound of the Dead in Sindhi. It is located in the Indus Valley. Once again, to better understand its origins, we first need to talk about the civilization that built it, the Indus Valley Civilization. We often hear about ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, where some of the earliest civilizations with states, cities, and writings emerged. But there was a third major cradle of civilization farther east, in South Asia, the Indus Valley. The Indus River flows from the Himalayas to the Indian Ocean, mainly through what is now Pakistan, and it played a role similar to that of the Nile in Egypt, or the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia. Along its banks, favorable conditions and productive agriculture supported growing populations and trade within the region. Cities emerged and flourished there during the Bronze Age. The Indus Valley Civilization extended across a very large area. Its remains have been found in modern Pakistan and northwestern India, as well as far north as Afghanistan. The earliest stages of this civilization date from the 4th millennium BC, around the same broad period as the development of civilization in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Based on the size of its cities and archaeological evidence, the Indus civilization reached maturity between 2600 and 1900 BC. This period overlapped with the Old and Middle Kingdoms of Egypt and with the rise of large cities in Mesopotamia. Some cities of the Indus Valley may have been as large as, or even larger than, their counterparts in Mesopotamia and Egypt. We are going to talk about Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, two urban sites that did not leave behind giant stone monuments, but each may have had between 3,000 and 60,000 inhabitants. This was an enormous population for the 3rd millennium BC. Feeding so many people required a network of surrounding villages and extensive areas of farmland. In Western accounts of ancient history and archaeology, the Indus Valley received less attention for a long time. This was partly because it was farther away from Europe, and because many Western views of antiquity were shaped by the Greco-Roman heritage. As a result, there was traditionally great interest in the Mediterranean and the Middle East, extending eastward as far as Persia, but less understanding of what had taken place beyond them. The Indus River was known to the Greeks and Romans. The Persian Empire had expanded into the Indus region, and Greek travelers had visited it. Alexander the Great also reached the region, but this was during the 1st millennium BC, long after the decline of large cities such as Mohenjo-Daro. At the time, however, there was no understanding that a civilization comparable to those of Mesopotamia and Egypt, had once developed there. This did not become clear until the early 20th century. Excavations that revealed Mohenjo-Daro began in the 1920s, and they gradually uncovered a city far larger than anyone had expected. Much of the site, however, still lies underground and has not been explored. Because we have no surviving ancient accounts of the city, and its script has not been deciphered, we do not know whether Mohenjo-Daro was the capital of a large state, an independent city-state, or something else. We do not know who governed it, and we know very little about how its inhabitants lived or what they believed. It is an enormous city, nearly 5,000 years old, and most of our knowledge of it comes from the artifacts found there and from the urban layout itself. But both are very impressive for the time and have given us some information about the city. Perhaps its most impressive feature is its urban planning. It is clear that the layout was carefully planned. The buildings followed a grid, so the city did not develop randomly. Instead, it was either organized according to a plan from the beginning or substantially rebuilt to make it both efficient and aesthetically pleasing. The buildings were constructed from fired bricks held together with mortar, and they probably had wooden roofs or upper structures. The organization of the city also suggests a fairly complex society. There was an upper city, raised on a large artificial platform made from mud bricks, which contained public baths, a large residential complex, and assembly halls. For this reason, this part of the city is known as the Citadel, although we do not know whether it had a military, political, or religious function. There was also a lower city, where tens of thousands of people may have lived. It included what may have been a central marketplace and a large public well, as well as many smaller wells. It has been estimated that the city may have contained around 700 wells, giving many households easy access to water. Wastewater was carried into drains that ran along the major streets. Some houses, presumably belonging to more prestigious or wealthier inhabitants, had separate rooms that may have been used for bathing, as well as inner courtyards. One building contained an underground furnace, possibly used to heat water. This degree of comfort and advanced urban planning is often associated with the much later cities of Greece and Rome, but it already existed at Mohenjo-Daro many centuries earlier. There is no other known example in the world of such a well-preserved city from the 3rd millennium BC, with features this advanced. Mohenjo-Daro had fortifications along some of its sides, including what appeared to have been guard towers, but it did not have a continuous series of walls, like some smaller Indus cities. This could indicate that the city was not seriously threatened by warfare, or perhaps that it was protected by a larger army. The possibility that it was a capital also seems reasonable, although this has not been proven. Apart from the structure of the city itself, the many artifacts found at the site provide us with some information about the city and the society that lived there. These include clay figurines, copper tools, seals, balance scales, and weights. The scales and weights suggest that there was probably some standardization of weights and measures. Jewelry was also found, including precious pieces made from gold and jasper. There were children's toys as well. Several furnaces indicate that metalworking was practiced, and more generally, there appears to have been a great deal of craft activity. An entire section of the city seems to have been dedicated to working with shells. Since Mohenjo-Daro is far from the sea, these shells must have been brought in through trade. The inhabitants had a script, examples of which have been found on seals and copper tablets. It remains undeciphered to this day. A female figurine, sometimes interpreted as an image of a mother goddess, was also found at the site. The worship of mother goddesses was common in many cultures of the Near East, and we know that there was contact between the Indus Valley and Mesopotamia while Mohenjo-Daro was inhabited. Another remarkable artifact is a sculpture known as the Priest King, even though there is no evidence that either kings or priests ruled the city. Still, it may have represented a figure of authority. The man has a neatly trimmed beard and wears an ornamented robe, although the meaning of these details is uncertain. Mohenjo-Daro was abandoned around 1900 BC, at a time when the entire Indus Valley Civilization was declining. In the case of this city, the decline may have been caused by repeated flooding or by changes that made the surrounding region less able to support such a large urban center. Afterward, the era of large cities in the Indus Valley came to an end for a long time, until new civilizations developed urban centers in the region, probably with little or no knowledge of the ruins of some of the oldest cities in the world. We've come to the end of our little journey tonight. I hope you enjoyed this adventure, and I invite you to discover and learn more. Now you can let go and sleep, or you can pick another story from my ever-growing library. And until we meet again, good night, sleep well.